Ben Palmer from Open. I'm a director there. We are an Edinburgh-based practice. We're landscape-led, but we bring together quite a few different disciplines, including architecture and master planning as well. So we have offices in Manchester and London. So we spread throughout the country, but really based in Edinburgh. And it's been really interesting actually looking back through this. I got slightly hung up on the idea of an icon, or what an icon is. And the idea that actually with Cardross, there's an icon there, and it exists, and people like it, and it's sunk into the cultural conscience in a way. And the V&A isn't even finished yet. It's halfway through building. We started in 2010 at the design competition. So it's the idea of is this an icon yet? Is it got the potential to be an icon? How does that work, and how does it happen? So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll try not to labour on that too much. I thought it'd be interesting to go back and look at the process of how that's built up over time and how we've got to the point where we are now, a bit about how the landscape is working on the project, and then some of the other bits and pieces that are happening in and around Dundee that we're involved with as well. And some of those projects are quite nice kind of juxtapositions as well. I'm not claiming them to be iconic, just of interest. So an icon, I did the obvious thing. I looked in a dictionary online and I found a definition and I put it on a screen. And it's obvious what an icon is, but I quite like the word veneration. I thought, you know, it's that thing that it becomes something that is venerated, and that's quite interesting. So, is it an icon yet? It's not really, because it doesn't even really exist. It hasn't had a chance to sink into the conscious. And what's the role of the landscape in this as well? And I think it's interesting to talk about how landscape has a role in these things, but it's not always the landscape that has to be iconic. It's about the project as well, and it's maybe about thinking holistically about the nature of the project and the role. So we thought about the V&A. The V&A is an iconic organisation. They definitely within the cultural conscience, and within that, it's a vehicle for other icons. I mean, this is like a who's who of who's who of cultural icons. They do some fantastic stuff. They bring all sorts of people. Cultural icon. I mean, you don't get much bigger than David Bowie, and this is what the V&A is doing. This is what they're bringing into allowing people to access. Dundee as a place, jute, jam, although I'd claim this is marmalade. I'm not sure marmalade is a jam, but still, we'll call it a jam. And journalism, and these are all things that people are familiar with, and these are all things that are heavily associated with Dundee. And there's other things as well, the spirit of adventure and exploration, connections to the Antarctic with Discovery, Scott Shackleton, hugely iconic. It's just a beautiful image. But these things still exist in Dundee, and this is what's still here, and this is right next to our site. It is venerated, it's a scheduled monument, and it's just fantastic. And we'll come back to it, and we'll show how the landscape's beginning to play between Discovery and the V&A. They're juxtaposed right next to each other. It's a very interesting thing. And that sort of spirit, pioneering spirit, keeps going in Dundee, and they now have you know, the tech industry, games industry, so it keeps going, and that's probably how this came to land here. But there's a bigger story behind it. How did we end up with the V&A at Dundee? Because it's not the V&A in Edinburgh, and it's not the V&A in Glasgow. So for the fourth biggest city in Scotland to pull, you know, the first permanent design museum in Scotland to Dundee is quite a coup, and it's how this built up. So going back a little bit, this area here, Dundee had a slight issue that the city centre kind of stopped on this line here, and the waterfront was down here. So way back, there was a 30-year master plan, regeneration master plan drawn up for Dundee, of which the infrastructure has now been implemented. £1 billion worth of infrastructure has gone in. And it's changed all of this. In here, really a space dominated by infrastructure, the ramps of the bridge. And you can see here, this was taken back in 2009, 2010. And just this hinterland between the city and between the waterfront. So they came up with a master plan, regeneration master plan, that looked to pull the city down to the waterfront, using it was very much a gridded approach to it, but using infrastructure, public space, big scale public spaces through here to begin to redress that. And the first phase of this is really looking at infrastructure. And it's not a very exciting plan, but it shows the first phases. This is where the £1 billion kind of went. And this was the ambition. And again, graphics from 10 years ago. It's, things have moved on slightly, but it shows the ambition. So where does the V&A fit in this? It fits, or it did fit, kind of there, in the water, just next to Discovery. So this was a point of bringing, I suppose it was a representation. It's a juxtaposition between the infrastructure, the necessary of the master plan, but also bringing something significant and cultural to an area as a draw and as a kind of a symbol of the ambition of what was happening. Connections, visual connections with the city centre as well. So these are just a few extracts from the original competition brief, and the brief originally was to do something within this red line, which is not on land, it's in the sea. So as a landscape architect, instantly slightly nervous about this, not quite sure where this is going to go. But as I mentioned before, the proximity next to Discovery is exciting. And you know, these were big development plots, the idea of hotel, mixed-use development coming right up to the riverfront. And it drew lots of attention, lots of entries. It whittled down to 5 competition entries. All sorts of things happening. Sutherland Hussey, so this involved Gross Max as well. And we were fortunate enough to be drawn into the Kengo Kuma team, so Japanese architect. We were working with a local architect at the time who actually courted Kengo Kuma and Associates and invited them to lead a team, and they brought us into that team. We were still a young practice at this point. We were only a year into optimized environments or open, so we felt very fortunate. As with all design competitions, we thought it would come to nothing, and thankfully this one did. But you can see it was really a building that was for exploring, and it referenced nature, it referenced landscape. This is a slide from one of Kuma's original sort of concept presentations, and it was about the cliffs, and it was about representing that, all the sort of the natural geology of the northeast coast. And here you can see the way that it was positioned in the Tay itself. And it's as a slight aside, when we were speaking to them originally, and we asked them, well, what do you think? What do you see here? I mean, it's very much an architect-led team, and we play a role in that. But they wanted the High Line. That's what they wanted. And the High Line's fantastic, but it's an iconic piece of landscape. And sometimes an icon can be a little bit limiting, because for other people, it's a reference point. So we've had to kind of challenge that and move on from that. And I think we kind of have. But it was just an interesting thing. Icons maybe aren't always the most useful thing. But a fantastic building, and you can see the deck around here. And I think it's always been an interesting project in the way that the landscape or the external is, you know, all these facades and all these different facets to the building are to be explored from the outside. And we can begin to see later on how that begins to happen. Another thing that happened after the competition is that the V&A kind of migrated from the sea onto land. And the cynical of you will say this is just because of budget. In a way, you know, there's lots of reasons for that move. But actually, if you've got that much land, if you're trying to regenerate an area, why put your building in the water? Why not use one of the development plots and actually put it onto the land? It brought it closer to Discovery, which is a challenge, but also quite an exciting thing. It almost becomes a series of 3 objects, which is quite nice. But it's still a building surrounded by water, and we looked at using very big scale water features, and that went through several iterations, and I'll go through that a bit as well. So that's pretty much where we've ended up. So here you can see the building. This is now it's on land, and how the water features sit, all the happy people walking around, and a very simple landscape. I think what's been nice about pulling this together is you remind yourself why we've done certain things. You can be reductive about your own projects and say, well, this is just paving and water features. But actually, it's been nice to go back and think about the ideas and why we did certain things and why it's maybe appropriate for this kind of building. And there's still the relationship with the water, the prow coming out into the Tay. It's all very dynamic. And as I said before, a building to be explored, a building to be walked around, walked through, and the idea of water on either side and the building above. You'll see on here, we'll come to this, but these very heavy balustrades all the way around, and make note of that. So this was really the scheme we developed probably about 3-5 years ago, and this is pretty much how it stayed through construction. So a public space, plaza, and this was really a sort of the frontage to the building. This is the main entrance coming in. This is kind of the service and delivery entrance, staff entrance through here. So a big plaza, they wanted it to be able to be used for events, so there's the usual power, supplies, all that kind of stuff in there. And then we developed a softer side to the scheme as well. So rather than the water features coming right out, begin to get some soft landscape in there too. So it begins to fall into slightly different areas, but still with a very restrained palette of materials. And when you have a restrained palette of materials, you need to be very careful about how it's detailed, and we explored lots of different ways of doing things, like simple things like how do you use paving, and this was just an exploration of how you can realize it in different ways. What's the soft landscape palette, and looking at an appropriate coastal approach to it. Again, the High Line crops up, but looking at Scottish kind of coastal landscapes and representing the beautiful areas in sort of the northeast of Fife and along the coast there, you've got this sort of pine and birch and fantastic things. Another major element through this was the balustrade against the water, and the balustrade that defines the edges of the site as well. And trying to come up with something that isn't too heavy, stops people from climbing over it, and there's lots of issues that needed to be resolved. Knowing that Dundee were going to roll this balustrade detail all the way along the waterfront, so it's not just for the V&A. So there was a lot of pressure on getting this right, and also making sure it was affordable, so that when they roll it down further along, it actually goes ahead in the same way. And lots of quite trudgy things like access control, fire tender access. So the simple landscape had to function in lots of different ways, and lots of different manners. Again, I agree, construction drawings don't really hold up too well on screen. So, but we had issues like access. This institution will hold, this building will hold quite valuable pieces of artwork. So there are insurance issues here. We went through the usual architectural liaison officer process. Counter-terrorism were quite interested. We looked at pass-rated bollard systems around the outside of the site. They were costed up. We moved away from that. And we looked at slightly different ways of creating a boundary or just creating a visual threshold to the site. And just the detail, just taking it on from looking at how paving could work. The difference between small units, big units, vehicle areas, pedestrian areas, subtle demarcation, using unit sizes that work together, and just that level of attention to detail. This was very early, well, this is the original tender drawing for the water edge. And it's not a very interesting drawing to look at, but the water features originally were meant to represent docks. So they were meant to look slightly grubby, like you couldn't see the bottom of them, and we needed a balustrade around it because they were deep. And we worked with a really good water feature specialist on this, a guy called Gordon Murray at Fountains Direct, and just the way that you can use water in different ways. So the way that the water was filtered meant that we still had lots of particles in there, and the way that it was treated, which was UV treatment, meant that the water would have a clarity to it and be safe, but actually the sides would become populated with string algae, and you get that kind of dock look to it. So if you ever want a grubby looking water feature, that's how you do it. The balustrades didn't go down very well at all. The council didn't like them. Visually they were intrusive. We couldn't get them to look right. So the water features went from being 600 deep to 150. The balustrades disappeared, and the approach to how we design the water feature completely changed. It's a very subtle change. Water depth is just shallower. But we then had to think about, well, these water features now are accessible. We don't want people in them, but people will go in them. So what's the base going to be? How do we deal with slip resistance? What about the water quality? Because a dirty, grubby water feature that people can go in is not particularly great. So the treatment system changed as well. And it's just that very subtle change, but all of those knock-on considerations that you have to go through. So when this was costed up halfway through value engineering, we had to build all that in and build in the different water treatment. We had to build in the anti-slip surface that cost a lot more. than the liner that was in there before. So, and then it went on site. And to move away from landscape for a minute, I mean, it's just an astonishing structure. It's a completely in situ cast concrete shell. It is pigmented concrete, so it's almost like a black concrete shell. And the whole thing, you can see here some of the formwork. They basically built the building twice. So the whole thing was built in formwork all the way up. Every piece of formwork here is unique. So you can just see the squares in here. No panel is the same, so every single bit has been bespoke made. In terms of sustainability, you could argue two ways on that one. But what you create is this amazing structure. Just some images of formwork. The formwork had to structurally hold the building before the roof went on. The roof is absolutely integral to the way that the building stays up. So, I mean, it's just, yeah, it's just an astounding thing. And this was saw earlier, the sort of the venal through the building, and this was it beginning to be formed. And you can see all the cast in. These little fixings are for the cladding planks that go on, little fixing rails that attach them. And this is just, that's a curved piece of in situ concrete, and it curves. It doesn't quite do it, but it almost is 45 degrees to 45 degrees, and it's just bizarre. Coming back to landscape. So this is where we were a few months ago. So you begin to see the outline of the water features here and here, and the paving. And it is one material throughout the whole scheme. It's one mid-grey granite, and it's detailed in different ways. This is, I probably should mention, it's all supplied by Hardscape. So Aidan's, I'll name check Aidan, and hopefully he remembers that at the bar later on. But it's all being installed by the main contractor. BAM is looking after the subcontractor. Carey's on this, and I have to say they're doing an absolutely phenomenal job. It's a very simple material, very simple principles, but there's nowhere to hide, and you have to get the detailing right. We did things at tender which we thought they'd design out, but things like staggered expansion joints, for those who like their detail. We never thought they'd do this, but they did it. We didn't want it to look panelled. We wanted the lines to be expressed, and we wanted these to read as one panel. So they've actually done it, and it does work. And you can see how close it is to Discovery. Here's Discovery over here. Very, very close indeed. Lots of insurance issues with cranes and oversailing and scheduled monuments. But the interesting thing is we've got a water feature here that butts up against a dry dock, and the interface was absolutely critical. From a safety point of view, visually we wanted it to look as though one just bled into the other. So when they're both full, you just have this seamless look to it. But this is a deep, dirty, dry dock, and we couldn't quite do that, so we do have a balustrade that runs along. And just more shots of building up. And again, for those that like their paving. So these are the two sizes blending into each other: vehicle spec paving, non-vehicle spec. That's the expansion joint before it gets filled in, just down there, so all very nice. And the water feature edge. And water features they make me nervous. But what's the standard way of warning people there's a water feature there? And there isn't a standard way, and you just have to come up with a way of doing the best you can in terms of contrast, in terms of textures. What's the edge going to be like? It's not straightforward. And I think this is where the landscape really comes in. And I think looking back at these, it's realizing that the building and the landscape are kind of almost seamless, and that the experience of walking through here is as much about the building as the landscape. This curved walkway that cuts through. These will be water features, so you get the reflection. So you'll almost get this kind of feeling you're walking through a complete tunnel, which just is quite mind-boggling, really. And how it sits in the Tay, that prow coming out. When they were constructing this, there was a cofferdam out here. So this is quite a recent thing that we can see. The cofferdam allowed them working space to actually get all the cladding on and finish the building. They've just taken that away over the last few weeks, so this is quite new for us to see. It's very exciting. And here we go. This is how it all works together. This isn't a full. This is just rainwater at the moment. But you can see the lining, very black lining. I think the first time I saw this, I was slightly blown away. You end up with 2 V&As for the price of 1, which is an absolute bargain. And this is where you begin to think about, is this iconic yet? Is this something people are going to come to? Is it going to sink into that, into the cultural sort of identity? And the way it sits next to Discovery and celebrates that as well as an object. And you can do all sorts of fun things with reflections and cameras and framing and just the view, the way that the prow sticks out, the other infrastructure that happens across there. So it's not finished yet, but it does begin to have that feel. So this is slightly older, but you can see the V&A sites here. This is the waterfront master plan, so you can see all the development plots coming in, new public space going in, and we've been lucky enough to do other projects with Dundee City Council. I'll just go through these very quickly. Slessor Gardens is a big event space for Dundee with a series of 10 by 10 pocket gardens down the side, each side of it. And we were lucky enough to work with them, work with Dundee to try and develop a concept for 8 of them. And we've since done another one, and we may be looking at a play area for them as well. And it was referencing back to Dundee and looking at the trade routes, where they used to ship to, and the discoveries that were there, the medical, the scientific, and we came up with a concept for 8 gardens, some based on local achievements and another one based on the trade routes. I mean, we developed these proposals, and they've been built, and they built these within 12 weeks. We did the concept for it, presented it. The Queen was coming to open it on the 6th of June, and we had 12 weeks to get it done. And we got there. We worked quite hard with the city to get there. And we did things like we reused, they had all this granite in their store left over from the master plan, so we scheduled it, we looked at it, and we reused it. So we managed to get quite a lot of quality material for quite a low cost for them. And they're not iconic, we're not claiming this. By the looks of it, the Queen didn't think they were iconic either. But the people of Dundee like them, and they use them in different ways, lots of opportunities to sit and enjoy. And it's just another facet to the master plan, which is a big, hefty, lumpy infrastructure project, and these just allow people to populate it. And this is before there are buildings there. So this is the main draw at the moment, if you are, I was going to say a human, but you know, for people to go to. And lastly, and this is kind of turning it on its head, because the V&A really is an architect-led project, and we understand that, and we understand our role on the project. And I think that's fine, because it's an iconic project, it's an iconic building, and our role in it is quite defined. But Dundee have asked us to look at this site here, which is right next to the V&A. And we've come up with, they had a big wish list of things they wanted in here. They wanted an urban beach, they wanted water features, and we came up with the idea of a walk to the beach where you come through the site and you go through pine woodland, and the idea of moving through dunes and that discovery of the waterfront, all that kind of stuff. But it also includes buildings, and the concept they had before had pavilions sitting within a landscape. So we took that and we built the buildings into the landscape. We didn't want to compete with the V&A, we wanted it to be quite low key, but this is a landscape-led project working with in-house architects. So it was a different way of looking at, so it's the flip side of the V&A. And again, I'm not claiming it's iconic, but this is what we've been doing. And it's a different setting for the V&A. It's a slightly softer look. So we were thinking about how you could perceive it from not only the city side, but also from this side as well. And the landforms that we use, the urban beach, V&A in the background, and the pavilions that sit within it too. And these are quite recent. We've just been working up ideas. So this is very initial stuff, but looking at architectural concepts, working with our architects that we have open as well. So this isn't, I'm not trying to do a big sum up, but there was something quite interesting in the press the other day. I was Googling Dundee icon or V&A Dundee icon, and that thing about things seeping into the public conscious, becoming a cultural thing that people reference. And I found a news article about Dundee's ice hockey team, the Dundee Stars, who I don't follow. I don't know if anyone else does, but their shirts for next season reference the V&A, and they use some of the patterns in the formwork there as well. I just thought it was quite an interesting thing that it's not finished yet, but people are already beginning to reference it, and maybe it is. It's got the best chance with all the different aspects that are thrown in there. So I'll leave you with a picture of the Dundee stars.